This is the gendered impact of climate change, the third event of the Environmental Security Thought Leadership Series being hosted by GW's Security Policy Studies program. So I am honored to facilitate this conversation with these three practitioners. First, we have Dr. Tegan Blaine. She is the Senior Advisor on on Environment and Conflict at the United States Institute of Peace. Prior to joining USIP, she led the climate change team in USAID's Bureau for Africa for over a decade, where she developed USAID's strategy and investment plan for its climate change work in Africa and built and led a team that provided thought leadership and technical support to USAID's Africa missions. Dr. Blaine has a doctorate in oceanography and climate from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography and a bachelor's degree in comparative literature and mathematical ecology from Brown. She has taught climate change and international development at the Elliott School and also at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Next, we have Lauren Herzer Risi. She's the program director of Environmental Change and Security Program at the Wilson Center, where she works with policymakers, practitioners, donors, and researchers to generate innovative transdisciplinary solutions to development and security challenges related to environmental change, natural resource management, and insecurity. Lauren holds a master's degree in environmental security and peace from the UN-mandated University for Peace in Costa Rica. And last but not least, we have Jennifer Grosman Fernandez, who is filling in for Dr. Jessica Smith, who is at COP26. Jennifer serves as climate diplomacy and gender specialist at the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. She focuses on the climate, gender, conflict nexus, including opportunities to leverage international frameworks to address these issues and best methods to empower women peace builders at the grassroots level. Previously, she worked at the U.S. Department of State in their Office of Global Change, the UNFCCC Gender Team, and the UN Foundation. She received a Master's of Science in Georgetown University's Foreign Service Program and also holds a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Washington in International Studies. So thank you for being here. The climate is changing faster than at any point in the history of modern civilization. We know that the secondary effects of global warming do include displacement, loss of livelihoods, political instability, and conflict. Conflict and weather are the top two drivers of migration or forced displacement. And UNHCR reports that an average of 21.5 million people were forcibly displaced each year by sudden weather-related hazards between 2008 and 2006. So as the effects of climate change intensify, it's important to understand the underlying factors that may mitigate or exacerbate migration. So with that, let's begin. And I'm going to turn it to Dr. Tegan Blaine to maybe set the stage for us and just provide some context.
Thank you so much, Allison. And I look forward to talking with everybody, both the people on the screen with me, but also all of the students participating in this seminar. I really look forward to hearing your questions and comments later. Although I'm at the U.S. Institute of Peace, what I'm going to do is step back from that and leave that part of the discussion to others to begin and take on a little bit more of my former USAID hat to talk a bit about the impacts of climate change on women from more of a development perspective. I think it's probably pretty obvious to everybody that women can potentially be differentially affected by climate change, but they can also be important agents of change in beginning to tackle those challenges. However, one thing that I'd like to start with is not thinking about kind of this women over here, men over there, but to recognize that gender intersects with a variety of social identities, social class, age, ethnicity, what you do for your livelihoods, and so on. And all of these combine in how we think about vulnerability. Women commonly face higher risks and greater burdens from climate change, especially in areas of poverty, in large part because their livelihoods depend heavily on natural resources. But it's not just that. There are a lot of social factors and cultural factors that go along with that. But one thing that we have discovered over time is that women can be really important in changing the dynamics. Obviously, women often aren't integrated into decision-making processes or political processes in many areas of the world. They have fewer land rights, they have fewer financial resources, they have less access to education. All of those things do increase their vulnerability, but I hate to just say, go help women, for example, because women are part of society and women can lead the change as well. But I'd like to talk for a couple of minutes about just how women do tend to be affected by climate change. One of the places where I start thinking about that, at least, is in the context of emergencies, weather-induced emergencies, which often leave women more vulnerable. In the places where I worked in Africa, for example, floods are a huge risk. Sometimes women haven't been taught to swim or are expected to stay closer to home and not leave unless they're accompanied. And so they're not as quick to get themselves out of harm's way. Sometimes they are more worried about the care of children or elderly people. And so again, they make different decisions about protecting others that may also jeopardize themselves in the immediate moment of emergencies. But in the aftermath of emergencies, many of which are becoming more and more common due to climate change, women also tend to be more vulnerable to things like gender-based violence, breakdowns in law and order, disruptions to livelihoods, and all of those kinds of things. But also, at least in Africa, and I can't claim to know much of other areas of the world, but at least in Africa, the agricultural workforce is heavily dominated by women. In many countries, the agricultural workforce is made up by, or 2/3 or more of it is women. And so women do tend to have a heavy reliance on natural resources, especially in poorer countries. Climate change impacts crops, and when crops fail, people lose access to food and lose access to income, which tends to impact women more quickly. In situations of hunger, women often don't tend to get as much access to the available food. They tend to go hungry faster. They lose money that they can use to pay school fees and other things. Women often tend to be tasked with things like gathering wood for fuel, whether for cooking or for staying warm, and also seeking out water. And especially with changing impacts on water resources, for example, that access to water, seeking out that water and bringing home water, that amount of time spent on that increases. Now, none of these are happening in isolation. They're all happening in the context of social change. And so one of the things that I do want to call out is that population increase, as well as how we've taken care of our natural environments and natural resources, do affect all of these things as well. But certainly climate change is a complicating factor for many of these. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention in terms of an impact is the changes in health and disease due to climate change. We're seeing changes in vector-borne diseases. We're seeing changes in the number of heat emergencies. Women can often be more vulnerable, specifically during pregnancy as well. Even in places like Europe, for example, in the extreme heat situation in Europe in 2003, women ended up accounting for 75% of the deaths from heat, and that's in Europe. And so you can imagine what the impacts are in other areas of the world where vector-borne disease, women are more exposed to vector-borne diseases or are more impacted by heat emergencies and things like that. So with that as kind of a stage setter or scene setter, I'll hand it off to others in this group to talk a bit more about some of the other angles.
Great, thank you. Lauren, do you want to step in?
Sure, Tegan, that was like a really nice way of introducing the gender perspective, so thank you. I was asked to speak initially at least, to the climate's connection to migration and natural resource management. And I can't do that without also talking about insecurity, given my position. And so I'm going to do a little bit of that. So I'm not actually going to speak specifically to gender in the next few minutes, but thinking about what Tegan has just laid out as how some of these impacts are experienced differently by women, you can make the effort to overlay some of that around what I'm going to say just now. Okay, so you've probably seen the headlines about mass migration that climate change is going to spark, but the reality of climate change's connection to migration is actually much more complicated than those headlines would have you believe. Oftentimes that's the case with headlines. So I'm going to see how much I can get to in the next 5 minutes. So the evidence is very clear though. Climate change is increasingly driving people to move. This increase in mobility takes many different shapes: internal, across borders, short-term, long-term, planned, or forced. Since 2010, the number of displaced people around the world has doubled. At the same time, the evidence is also mounting that climate change acts as a risk multiplier, not just for migration, but for conflict and human security as well. That is to say, climate change doesn't just add to insecurity, it compounds it. The risks that people are already facing in their day-to-day lives, like access to food, to clean water, ongoing political instability, are magnified in ways that create new threats, that make it harder for governments to respond, that worsen ongoing conflicts, and can have cascading impacts across societies. Let's look at the Sahel for an example. In the last 2 years alone, the number of internally displaced people has quadrupled. According to UNHCR, there are over 3.7 million people displaced in the region. 2 million of those are displaced within their home country, so they're internally displaced. And they often end up in situations that aren't much better than the ones they left. The crisis of forced displacement in the Sahel is driven by violent conflict and instability, but the root causes go deeper to issues of extreme poverty, corruption, weak governance, growing inequality. All of these factors are further compounded by climate's impacts. And how these connections play out is very complex. It's not as simple as A leads to B leads to C. One of the challenges of climate change is the unpredictability of its specific impacts. We know that the frequency and severity of storms and droughts are increasing, but what that means for specific locations and communities on the ground is harder to know. And what the knock-on effects of its impacts, how those impacts interact with existing vulnerabilities like social unrest, ongoing environmental degradation, poverty, a pandemic, an economic crisis, is much harder to know. So we'll come back to this because this is one of the key reasons that inclusive, diverse representation in climate response is so critical. But working out how, where, and to what degree climate change influences migration is complicated, but it's not something that we can ignore. So let's take a minute to talk about migration and mobility on its own. Migration itself is not bad, and I can't stress this enough. Migration on its own is not a threat. Since the beginning of time, people all over the world have used migration as an important strategy to adapt and build resilience to changing environmental and economic conditions. Migration is an important and can be a peaceful way to adapt to climate change if it's enabled by smart policy. It can act as a kind of pressure relief valve for communities and provide important remittances to people back home that enable them to adapt more effectively to climate impacts. So we want to avoid forced displacement, where people are forced to move and it's not a choice that they make, and enable safe, well-managed migration for those who choose to move. When you start pulling on the threads of people's decision to move, you find out that there is very rarely one factor at play. It's usually a combination of social, political, economic, demographic, and environmental factors that are informing a person's decision to move. Climate impacts increasingly are influencing each of those factors. And climate's most immediate impacts are being felt in the parts of the world least ready to respond. I think, the case study of Syria is an illustrative one. It can help us sort of understand how climate change can stress systems and lead to increased migration, but also the role that governance and decision-making plays in making things better or making them worse. So if you don't mind, I'll just take a minute to talk about Syria to illustrate some of these connections. In 2007, a 3-year drought occurred in Syria. It's been recognized scientifically that the drought was exacerbated by climate change. So this is a climate-induced drought in Syria that led to the collapse of crops and livestock in the northeastern breadbasket region of the country. At the same time, the Assad regime had instituted some really bad policies governing water access. Coupled with the drought's impacts on farmers, this led to a huge number of rural migrants moving to cities. Those cities were already burdened by Iraqi refugees who arrived after the US invaded Iraq in 2003. In 2010, internally displaced persons and Iraqi refugees made up about 20% of Syria's urban population. That was a 50% increase in just 8 years and put an incredible amount of strain on cities' already limited resources and decaying infrastructure. Against this backdrop, you had the Arab Spring, which was beginning to sweep across the region. The Arab Spring itself was sparked in part by a drought in Russia that led to sharp increases in global food prices. So in March 2011, peaceful protests broke out in Syria. Assad's regime responded by torturing youthful protesters, and anger spread. And so what had previously been considered an unlikely uprising began to take shape. I'm hoping that this gives you a sense of how climate change is interacting with and influencing migration and what this means for communities on the ground. There is good news. There are steps that we can take to more effectively respond to these risks, and gender is an incredibly important aspect of that conversation, as we heard Tegan speak to, and I think we're going to turn it over to Jennifer now to get a little bit more into the gender perspective. So I'll stop there for now.
Great, thank you for that context, and I really like that case study. So Jennifer, why don't we turn it to you about, the climate, gender, security nexus and how that's important.
Yes. Well, thank you. I'm so happy to be here today, hear from the panelists and this audience, and look forward to our discussion later. So at the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security, we recognize climate change as a factor that cuts across gender and security, with implications both for policymakers and practitioners, not to mention those actually impacted by these climate-related conflicts. In our work, we've realized the importance of bridging silos between experts, so it's wonderful to connect with this audience today. Earlier this year, we released a report on the climate-gender conflict nexus that highlighted women's contributions at the grassroots. And in the chat box, I posted some links with a handout with a graphic and the report, as well as an option to attend our event. We're hosting an official side event at COP26 on climate security on Monday. So that will also be streamed if people are interested in attending. But I really think, we need to realize, why are we even talking about the gendered impacts of climate change when we see COP26, we see all this climate movement, climate policy, why is gender an important factor here? And that's because the evidence on the ground shows that understanding the overlapping and reinforcing drivers of climate and conflict can lead to better outcomes and ensure solutions are mutually reinforcing. Critically, climate interventions must be informed by a gender analysis, because climate impacts don't exist in a vacuum, as we've already been over today. Rather, they're layered on top of instability, humanitarian crises, and weak governance, all of which magnify gender inequality. And in that handout link, there's actually a map from a USAID report overlaying state fragility and climate risks. That's pretty helpful visualization of these factors. So the gendered impacts of climate change and the ways in which women are disproportionately affected and less able to recover from climate shocks, in many cases mirror the same vulnerabilities women face in situations of conflict. And we've been over a few of these factors, but they can include discriminatory gender norms, gender distribution of labor, discrepancies in human capital and decision-making power, all of which lead to uneven impacts on women. As we've discussed, intersectionality is really important here because women from marginalized groups face heightened challenges. And Tegan mentioned that women are responsible for a disproportionate share of unpaid labor. And we're seeing that in Somalia, where resource scarcity, exacerbated by shifting precipitation patterns, contributes to higher rates of clan violence and honor killings, which particularly harm women. Early marriage rates have also risen as families cope with livelihood insecurity. And as climate stressors displace people into IDP camps, rates of sexual violence rise. At the height of the 2017 drought, GBV increased by 9%. Lauren brought up that women are also often hardest hit by forced displacement and migration. Central America is challenged by overlapping crises of weak governance, economic insecurity, and gang violence. And those have been heightened by sudden onset climate impacts, particularly hurricanes, which deplete livelihoods and serve as a push factor for migration. So this cumulative and interlocking effect of lack of access to land, increased labor burden due to out-migration of men, rise in domestic violence, and food insecurity places women in a vulnerable position and limits their ability to adapt to climate change. And the women who do migrate also face gender-based violence and trafficking risks. So this failure to insulate vulnerable communities from climate conflict risks could further erode state legitimacy, thereby contributing to amplified fragility, which especially hinders women and girls. And we know that that also further drives community insecurity. So in light of these interlocked feedback nature of these drivers, it's key for security professionals outside the environmental peace building and gender fields to account for the gendered impacts of climate change. So what's really key to remember is that while women are disproportionately affected by climate change, they're on the front lines of addressing these challenges. And moving the needle on gender inequality has direct implications for global peace and security. We know from the Institute's Global Index on Women, Peace, and Security that where women are doing better, countries are more stable. And analysis has found that countries that score better on our index are also better positioned to address climate change. So in that handout, there is a graphic highlighting that correlation. At GIWPS, our report looked at how the dynamics of climate change and conflict are unfolding in Colombia, Sudan, and Nepal, and how in each case women are contributing to enhance peace and sustainability despite these gendered obstacles. Just really briefly, in one example in Colombia, where natural resource competition drove much of the conflict, women faced the combined challenges of insecure land tenure, natural resource degradation, and climate change related impacts on agriculture. Collectively, these threaten the country's fragile peace. But Afro-Colombian and indigenous women are leveraging the peace process to cement their place in environmental activism. They're advocating for land tenure security, and that builds climate resilience in addition to reducing community tensions. And we've touched on this a bit, but we do want to highlight that we're not just talking about women here, but the full spectrum of gender relations and gendered identities, and how important it is to engage with men and boys. In Sudan, we're seeing competition between pastoralists and farmers escalate into conflict. And there, women are building their knowledge and capacity and sustainable natural resource management in conjunction with this pilot project that's looking at gender sensitivity training for men and boys to better improve relations and better improve the uptake of women's leadership in these spaces. So we do want to make sure that policymakers aren't only considering women's vulnerability, but their capacity and their role as agents of change, as Tegan mentioned. And I think that's why it's so exciting to hear from the panelists today on what they're seeing, in their work on how to advance these efforts.
Definitely. Thank you, Jennifer. Because this is a complex topic and, it's important to bridge the silos, and it's important to adopt an intersectional lens to strategy, policy, and research. So for the next 15 minutes, we're going to discuss that. And if you have any questions, please pop it in the chat, and the last 15 minutes will be Q&A. So with that, why don't we turn to Lauren to talk about inclusive dialogue and diverse leadership?
Sure. I think that hopefully what you've gotten from this so far is that there's like sort of no easy way to respond to climate change. There's no one avenue. And so one of the, and I think what we're seeing this sort of reflected in COP too, is that climate change requires this whole of society, whole of government approach to be truly effective in our responses. And in that, gender needs to be a big part of the conversation, and identity and indigeneity, and thinking about how we make decisions differently, and who is at the table to help make those decisions. And it's not just about sort of the responses. It's in order to really understand what the risks are, you need to have everybody at the table, and you need to be thinking, we call it the scales of decision making, but you need to be sort of looking at the local all the way on up to the sort of state level, regional, international, and thinking about how the risks sort of cascade across those levels of decision making, but also how the responses do. And so that you're not sort of unintentionally creating sort of negative consequences in your responses to climate change because you've left a critical part of the conversation out, and gender being a big part of that. I think, you know, in the case of sort of migration, well, you know, because most migration occurs within borders, and that, you know, might change with climate change, but historically that's the case, right? Despite sort of the rhetoric around migration, most of those displaced are displaced within their own countries. And so strengthening inclusive local institutions and forms of resource management can really help ease the transition for both migrants and receiving communities. This requires engaging local communities from the outset of planning for climate responses, but also for understanding the community's perception of the risks they face. And to have a full sort of risk analysis, women need to be part of that conversation. And you also need to understand sort of the dynamics between women and men in a community. And I'm sorry, I know that gender, I should be more inclusive, but like so not just women and men, but all sort of the full gender spectrum needs to be included in that conversation so that you can really understand what the context is and what the dynamics are at play and how climate change is going to interact with those. And that will give you a clear sense of where there are really entry points for more effective responses that are at a minimum not going to create unintentional sort of negative consequences, and ideally sort of create co-benefits across. And so, you know, this requires, and I think Tegan can really speak to this because I think there's been, especially with the way gender has been incorporated in USAID's sort of development, and we're seeing that now with climate change, it's creating this major shift in sort of thinking about development and diplomacy and all of the defense in terms of sectors, right? So that like traditionally there's like the food and there's the water and there's like the health and all of these other sectors, and climate change is forcing us to recognize that none of these are operating in a vacuum, and no matter, you know, so where there are risks and where there are responses is going to have impacts across. And so it's really actually providing an opportunity to think more effectively and holistically about how we do development and how we cooperate with international partners and how we think about what constitutes security. I'll stop there because I think I'm just rambling at this point. Thank you.
No, I think that was helpful. Why don't we turn to Dr. Blaine to just maybe go into some gender mainstreaming into development and her examples on the ground, and then Jennifer, touch on the Women, Peace, and Security agenda.
Sure. You know, I second so much of what Lauren said, that this is really not necessarily, gender isn't an issue unto itself, but thinking about how we integrate women and integrate a whole variety of vulnerable populations into the conversations to understand the situation and also into the solutions is so critical. And women are part of it, but not an exclusive part of that conversation, certainly. You know, I perhaps will just focus a little bit on two examples. One from recent experience that I've had consulting for one of the WHO offices, and then one from USAID. It's amazing how simple solutions can be sometimes, and how impactful small things can be if you're actually thinking and working with the people affected by a certain thing. And there I would throw in just one example from the health sector on climate change and health. During heat emergencies, for example, one of the most vulnerable populations in a hospital setting is women who are in the maternity ward. And a lot of hospitals in the kinds of countries in which many of us have worked don't have access to air conditioning, don't have good ways to address some of the heat emergencies. And what has happened in some hospitals, just through engaging women in the thinking process about how to protect women who are going into labor during these kinds of emergencies is something very simple that emerged from that conversations. How about putting the maternity ward on the first level of the hospital, which tends to be the coolest, a very low cost solution, which probably would not have emerged unless women were engaged in doing some brainstorming about how to protect them during a very vulnerable point in their lives in a hospital setting. And making simple changes like that can emerge from consultations that are kind of engage a wider group of people into kind of the creative decision process, can highlight issues that other people aren't thinking about. And sometimes the opportunities to address those can be creative, low cost, fairly easy to implement solutions. Another example that I might throw out is just from the work that my bureau did when I was at USAID on climate services. Climate services refers to using scientific information in decision making. And traditionally that has been scientists providing information to communities, which theoretically are going to take up that information and use it. And nothing about that works the way that people used to think 10 or 15 years ago. First off, scientists often don't know what information communities actually need and are likely to use. Second off, they often don't understand how to get the information out. And third off, they often don't understand the local context, which is a lot about where women come in. And so some of the research that the Africa Bureau did at USAID was really thinking not just about how to get scientists working more closely with communities, but the role of women in climate services. How do we engage women in thinking about what kinds of climate services they're interested in? For example, women often work on different parts of the agricultural sector than men. And so if you bring men to the table, they might say, we need climate services that are going to help us understand, when we should be harvesting maize. Women might come in and say, actually, that's not our priority at all. We're concerned about crops X, Y, and Z. And, those are different issues that we need to address. And so having women at the table during those conversations might yield insight into where information can be used both by men and by women. But also women receive information differently. So in the past, climate services often would be channeled down to male leaders of communities who might be great at distributing information to the male community, but women might receive information differently. The access points might be different. The language might be different. You might find that women are not necessarily as fluent in some of the languages that are often used for communication via radio and so on. And so having more stuff in local languages or having entry points into women leaders who can then distribute information might be very critical. So we're talking about an interest in different types of information, women who are going to use that information differently, different modes of communication can be important. And then also, quite frankly, different ways of supporting change. Women have different access to education, different access to finance that enables them to choose how they act on that information and all sorts of things. And so when you begin to engage women in the co-development of something like climate services from the beginning, or think more widely about how you engage an entire community in that co-development from the beginning of things like climate services, you end up with better outcomes. The same principle can be applied to things like improved cook stoves, engaging a wide variety of stakeholders in the process can lead to insights into what technologies will actually be taken up. That goes for renewable energy, off-grid renewable energy alternatives as well. And a lot of these things can actually make people's lives better in many different ways and give women opportunities to be more involved in powerful roles or in controlling these kinds of resources. And so those kinds of things are important too. The last thing that I might just say is one thing that we have learned from our own experience in the United States, for example, as women take on more leadership roles, is that organizations who have more diverse leadership tend to result in greater considerations of sustainability and tend to have more impactful outcomes. And I think that those lessons from the United States, for example, in integrating more women into more leadership roles, are likely to have the exact same impact over the entire world. And thinking about ways that we can engage women and also a greater variety of stakeholders in thinking about the vulnerabilities to climate change, being engaged in decisions around approaches, empowering women to speak up and to lobby for what they want and need as part of this process is an incredible way to help them make their lives better and contribute to the goal of increased equality of both women within a male-dominated society, but also of marginalized groups writ large. With that, I'll hand off to Jennifer.
No, thank you. I think it's so important, the community engagement, inclusivity, just really hit home. So for Jennifer, the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda, it's from the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 and the subsequent resolutions. It doesn't mention climate change, but it does, set up an institutional framework for including women in peace and security and everything that is related to that. So I just wonder, what are your thoughts on the impact and the utilization of the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda in climate?
Yes, so Tegan remarks actually got me thinking about another case study. So quick tangent. Your point about women have different access points, use climate services, I think is really key, and also relates to a security situation, and that's kind of like the larger conversation with talking about the gendered impacts of climate security is how to make that case to policymakers that this actually relates to their traditional hard security issues. And if you're looking at the case of Mali, where you have a sizable UN peacekeeping force, you're having conflicts sort of spiral out, increased tensions between pastoralists and farmers. There was an NGO there that was trying to map out water access points in a community, and they went to the traditional leaders of the community, which are generally men, always men, and they created a map of the water points as a way to reduce tensions between different ethnic groups, pastoralist farmers, parts of the community. And then they brought that to some women in the community and who had a completely different picture of where these resources were and how they're being used. So, just an example, the UN peacekeeping forces, the US is heavily involved, obviously not part of the world. If we're coming in and try to do a climate related, security intervention, we need to make sure it's actually effective. And if you're not talking to women, if you're not empowering them, it's just not going to be really effective at the end of the day. So just a quick aside, because I thought that was an interesting case study. But going back to the WPS agenda, for those that aren't familiar, Allison laid it out pretty well. This was a series of resolutions adopted by the UN Security Council, really with the goal of, integrating gender throughout the spectrum of conflict, from conflict prevention to post-conflict reconstruction. So what actually wasn't until the 8th resolution in 2015 that there was a cursory reference to climate change. So this is just an example that we do have these institutional frameworks, both nationally here in the US, globally within different, security mechanisms that could be leveraged to advance this climate security gender work, but aren't being taken advantage of right now. And in the case of WPS, we have that WPS national action plans, but only 1 in 4 make a direct reference to climate, but that could be a very powerful mechanism. The U.S. National Action Plan in 2016 did recognize the impact of climate change on women, but last year, various agencies, DoD, state, aid, and DHS released their strategies to actually implement the WPS National Action Plan, and only USAID included one passing reference to climate. Now, clearly, those plans were made under the previous administration, which didn't prioritize climate. So we can expect that this is now a new opportunity to leverage the DoD's, states, and USAID's work in WPS to really integrate the risks and unique impacts of climate-induced conflicts. So, because we know that integrating climate security will improve the effectiveness of these strategies. Beyond WPS, just very briefly, if you go in the Q&A, we really see this as a window of opportunity to bring together various threads of climate resilience, of security work, and of gender work. Beyond WPS, we have the Global Fragility Act and Strategy. We have the recent intelligent community assessments on the security threats posed by climate change. The Biden administration has moved to center climate in U.S. foreign policy and national security. We're obviously seeing that this week with the high-level commitments at COP26 in Glasgow. So all of this really represent a window of opportunity to bridge silos, leverage political will, take advantage of these institutional frameworks, and importantly, funding, so we can better prevent and address conflict. And I think that's really a great reason why we're meeting here today, because we have students with a lot of different backgrounds, and obviously this is future professionals in the security space. It's great to kind of keep this in mind. How can we bridge silos and bring together various efforts to really push the needle?
Great, thank you. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to pop it in the Q&A. I'm going to pose Tina's question. Not sure who would want to take it, so I'll leave that up to you. But she's wondering about the renewable energy transition and whether you see an opportunity to increase women's access and marginalized populations to electricity as we transition to the renewable, grid. And also, do you think projects currently focusing on supporting the transition would reinforce existing inequalities, or do you think there's an opportunity to maybe change it? But in her question, she was thinking about Saudi Arabia and Nigeria. So maybe Lauren or Dr. Blaine?
I can start, and then Tegan, you can take what I say and make it sound better or make more sense of it. I think that's a really good question. So one thing to note, though, is that in a lot of these places, it's not a transition. It's not like an energy transition. They just don't have energy, period, right? So like thinking about how then this gets into sort of questions about justice and what does climate response mean for the communities who are least responsible for climate change, but are already dealing with its impacts and lack access to sort of critical, sort of essential services, including energy. And how do you help? And so this gets into like, how are we using climate finance to support those communities' access to energy in ways that align with our climate response, but sort of recognize where there are pretty significant gaps. So I think that, that's one important thing to note. I don't know that I can speak to like specific projects or initiatives and how they're going to impact women, except to say that this is one of the reasons why gender needs to be a big part of the conversation in our responses. And because we don't want to exacerbate existing inequalities, we want to have those responses sort of lift everybody up. Sorry, my dog is shaking in the background. The other, I wanted to make a point, and so I'm so sorry, my computer is just like really tough these days, and so it crashed on me. But I thought Tegan's point, you had made some really good points about where there are low cost interventions, and one of the things that came out in that to me is also that a climate response doesn't always look like a climate response, right? And if you're not incorporating a diverse, diverse and sort of representative voices in the climate discussions, you're going to miss opportunities to find those responses that don't require climate funding and aren't necessarily in the climate bucket, but are going to help build the resilience to climate in communities. I'm sorry, I'm totally going off track. But I think that question about the renewable energy transition is a really important one, and sort of speaks to the reason to ensure that women and diverse genders are included in this conversation, so that we don't, it goes back to that sort of unintentionally creating sort of worse circumstances for people on the ground in our efforts to do good, right?
I might add a little bit to what Lauren has said here so far. Number one, I think that there's a difference whether we're talking about grid energy that's renewable energy or whether we're talking about off-grid options. And I suspect that you know, the increase in access to grid energy is not going to, well, there may be differential access to grid energy, but the grid energy itself is kind of gender neutral. But implementing off-grid access or off-grid energy solutions, especially renewable ones, does have, there definitely is a role for, or a space for thinking about how that enables a variety of stakeholders, including women, to access energy in a way they haven't before, and thinking about how that can help lift up a whole variety of members of the community. The other thing that I might pull out of that is that there are a lot of ways that implementing renewable energy, especially at the grid level, can exacerbate inequalities within the community. And this can take many forms. It's often about access to land. It also can be access to other benefits of the investments. And I would just call out Chris Collins, who's a student with all of you and who works with me at USIP, who has written a couple of really interesting pieces on that recently for the USIP website. And so hopefully he's listening in and might even be able to drop a couple of links in the chat. But I kind of am taken back to a time that I was in East Africa in the Nairobi area, beginning to work on energy issues. And first off, one day we were going to go out to a new point where some wind energy was supposed to be installed. US government caravan, you know, you've got all the diplomatic vehicles, it's kind of sometimes, but we showed up in this community and there was a protest going on. And eventually the drivers decided that we had to turn around and head back, that they didn't want to take us into that situation. And it was basically a community protest about the installation of renewable energy, in this case, wind energy, because the community hadn't been considered in the process. And the possibility of kind of assumption of land rights and so on, which can impact more vulnerable communities, was certainly there. I think it was that same week or maybe another trip that I also went out to a geothermal facility outside of Nairobi. And, you know, Kenya has made such inroads in the geothermal community, or in installation of geothermal energy, which is a really critical opportunity for renewable energy. However, as geothermal energy was beginning to be put in, there were promises made to communities that were displaced by the process about access to water, access to some of the benefits from the sale of geothermal electricity. And those benefits have not been realized. And so in the process of the development of some of these renewable resources, there are certainly unintended consequences that are not being, I mean, there is some discussion of them, but I think that there needs to be quite a bit more recognition and about how the application or how the development of renewable energy can exacerbate inequalities, and women are part of that. And so thinking about how that intersects with access to land, for example, especially in informal communities. When we think about who gets some of the benefits from these, all of that also does intersect with gender.
Great. There's some awesome resources that are being thrown up in the chat. I'll make sure everyone gets them. There's a question from Noelle that I wanted to pose to Jennifer. She was wondering if there should be a new WPS UN Security Council resolution acknowledging the relationship between gender and climate to help ensure global peace and stability. And I just wonder, as you answer the question, Jennifer, can maybe touch on the conversation we had before we started recording about COP26 and what Dr. Smith is doing on the gender climate discussion.
Sure. Yeah, so thank you, Noelle, for that question. I think, you will see a lot of different stakeholders with different opinions on a new resolution. But there is also a pretty common belief that we've had, quite a few resolutions on WP security, and progress has stalled quite a bit. Obviously, that varies by country. You are seeing some great progress in some spots where you have the political will and leadership galvanizing. So if we're going to spend a lot of effort by civil society, academics, stakeholders within governments directed towards this issue, a new resolution might not be the best deployment of that effort. It's really at these implementation levels at the national context where you can make progress. As I mentioned, the US released our implementation strategies last year, but that was under a previous administration, reflecting the priority differences. So obviously within agency, it's its own process and timeline on how to actually get these strategies on the ground, the programs, the funding. And that's a place where you can really push for interventions that address the heart of this nexus. I would say, kind of stepping back from the WPS agenda, it's very interesting to see the momentum around climate security right now globally. We did see the UN Security Council take up climate security twice this year onto high-level open debates, with some parties, more proponents of integrating a climate security lens to the UN Security Council operations. In particular, there's a group of friends for climate and security. I believe has like 60 countries signed on right now. Germany is a big leader in there, Ireland, Norway, Kenya, quite a few. There's some pushback. You can probably assume who on the Security Council is maybe not most keen on that. Russia, China, we're also seeing India at the UN level, not really an agreement that climate security should be integrated in the UN's work. But there is a new climate security risk mechanism being deployed. There's a push for climate risk assessments, for climate security to be integrated in peacekeeping forces. So I think the question really there is, how do we make sure that gender is also part of this? How do we link WPS with what's happening globally? And as Allison alluded to, Dr. Smith, who should have been here today, she's in Glasgow right now. We're doing an event on Monday that's kind of at the margins of COP, since COP addresses the Paris Agreement, the implementation of that, but related is, how do we integrate security work, across the international, national, and sub-regional levels. And I do think there's an opportunity to leverage this political momentum, and we're seeing that in the US with the DoD's new climate assessment last week, how to make sure that gender is included. And I think that is really the opportunity we have right now. So a bit of a long-winded answer to that, but there's just a lot happening, a lot of momentum after many years of advocacy.
That's awesome. No, thank you for that. I mean, this is such an important time, moving forward. And I thank everyone for attending and questions. I would like to conclude maybe with each of the panelists just providing some final concluding remarks, to us students in security or in gender, whether it's the environment, what is the best advice you have as we help tackle these challenges? Try to be inclusive, try to consider everything. What are some concluding remarks you have for us? Why don't we start with Dr. Blaine? No?
I was thinking I might need a moment to think about that. If somebody else has a good starting comment, please jump in.
Lauren, you look like you may.
I mean, I don't know if it's good, but I would say, well, actually, I wanted to ask one thing. Did you guys talk about the gender strategy? Since I got sort of knocked off, did you talk about the gender strategy? Okay, so like a couple weeks ago, there were all these climate security products that were released by the Biden administration, right? You had the National Intelligence Assessment, the DoD's Climate Risk Assessment, the Climate Migration Report from the NSC, the White House, and the DHS's Framework for Climate Response. At the same time, or like a day later, I think the gender strategy was released, and the gender strategy has climate all over it. And that is like a really exciting message, right? That the US government is like the administration is sending out that climate is going to be integrated across. I don't know that gender really came out in the climate security products, right? And so there's definitely an opportunity to be making that message more clear. I would say that you all are like, I'm kind of jealous. I wish I could be like a student right now and like 20 years younger, because you're all in a really exciting position of being able to sort of harness this momentum and make something of it. And you're in a position to be sort of from the outset thinking about security in a more comprehensive and effective way, really. And there's already sort of this broadening of what it means to be inclusive and what is gender, and like, and that being able to take that up and integrate it into sort of international relations and political science and all these security sort of discussions is going to be what gets us sort of ahead in terms of responding to climate change and insecurity. So I would say that I hope that you're interested to do that, and that you reach out if there's ways that we can be supportive of that. But I think that you'll all be leading this work. And so it's great that you're paying attention now.
Thank you. Jennifer?
Yeah, I think, Lauren, thank you so much for bringing up those reports. And it was, I think, really fantastic to see that climate was in the White House's gender equity and equality, I believe, report. But that was wonderful. And you're right that those other major landmark climate products didn't mention gender, for what I can tell, minus the climate migration report, actually did see gender as a cross-cutting issue, proposing that the US government have gender-tailored strategies in dealing with these vulnerable populations, which I thought was a really great step forward. But I think that points to the larger issue that probably most of us on the Zoom are a bit of an audience that's already bought in that gender is important. And from what I can tell, the fact that climate impacts security is an argument that's just now being accepted into the mainstream foreign policy and security spaces. So we have work to make that connection, even one layer deeper. That's actually the gendered impacts of climate security. And I think for students and professionals, in their careers, in those discussions, just always asking, well, what are the gendered implications of this? Because the fact is, many hardworking people that are interested in this field, obviously, are hoping to make a positive, contribution to peace building, but they may just not realize. If you don't ask the questions, gender is that invisible, sea around us. If you don't ask the questions, then it's not highlighted. But by asking a few questions, having some case studies at GIWPS, we're working on building up the evidence base so policymakers can point to specifics of this is why gender is important. This is the co-benefits of it. Having that in your pocket, so when you're in these discussions, that helps make that case and really, advances this work down the line.
I can build now on both what Lauren and Jennifer have both said, which is great. Lauren, thank you for highlighting the gender strategy. I have such a climate change lens. I missed that. So I am going to have to go look. But just picking up on what Lauren said about how, for those of us who are 20 or 30 years older, it's an exciting time to be starting your career and able to impact all of this. And I would suggest one place where every single one of you can currently have impact. USAID released its draft climate change strategy yesterday and is asking for comments and input from everybody under the sun. USAID puts more money into climate change work internationally than any other part of the federal government in terms of its bilateral relationships. And so go read that strategy. See if you like how gender issues and gender insecurity issues are being integrated into it. I'm only a few pages in myself. I haven't reviewed the entire thing, so I can't claim to have any expertise on this yet, but it's an immediate place where you can have impact by providing comments today, not 3 weeks from now, not a year from now, not waiting to finish your degree. Start now. And with that, I'll finish.
I love that. Thank you everyone for your participation. Thank you speakers for attending, and just to kind of close what Lauren said, let's keep up this momentum and always include, gender in everything we do climate related. So thank you, everybody.